Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for our COVID-19 Resources in Our Communities webinar. My name is Sandy Ratliff. I'm with Virginia Community Capital, and we're happy to partner with the Virginia Department of Housing and Community Development and the Virginia Small Business Development Center Network to host these sessions weekly. Our objective is to provide you with some of the latest resources and tips to help you through this pandemic. Before we get started and I introduce our speaker, I wanted to let you know that in order to keep the webinar flowing and staying within our 1 hour time frame, we have everyone muted. However, I know that we want to hear from you, and you have two ways. If you have a question for Sarah, if you will put those in the Q&A section or in the chat feature, and we will get to those at the end of the presentation. You know, with the second quarter quickly exiting, it is time that we all look to redraw the end of the year. And Sarah Milton, Sarah is the CEO and founder of the Spark Mill, is going to lead our discussions today, giving you some considerations to help you get back on track. She will chat with some of the customers' needs and behaviors, strategic plans, forecasting, and necessary adaptations. Our plans are that after this session, we will be sharing Sarah's slide deck. But Sarah, I'm going to turn it over to you, and you can take over the program.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so let me share my screen. So welcome everyone. It's nice to visit with you. So when I was putting this presentation together, part of what I was thinking about are all of the questions that people have been asking us so far. I don't know that I will have all of the answers. These are things to think about or consider. Your business or nonprofit is so very different from the next business or nonprofit that you're going to have some special circumstances. So perhaps not all of this will apply to you, but hopefully there's a framework here for you to think through things. So in the beginning, we're going to talk about what does it mean to reopen? What does that look like? And then we're going to talk about getting back on track in terms of strategy, employees, and customers. So on track. So here's some things that I think that you guys should be thinking about right now in terms of getting on track in order to reopen. So the first thing is, and I said this in the last webinar, so if you were there, there's a couple of slides that are the same because the advice is, very similar, is we're advising that people set up internal work groups. And I think that's really important because what you don't want to have happen is have a senior executive team make all of the decisions on how to reopen, lacking a little bit of the context of what it means for each individual employee section. So let's imagine that you have a workforce of 50 and you have truck drivers and janitorial staff and executives. The specific considerations around safety and social distancing that a truck driver would have versus what a janitorial staff or an executive would have are different. So it's important that you gather a small group of employees together and think through some of the steps as a team. That way you can be aware of the different constraints on the physical environment, the different constraints on hours of work and things like that, so that you're not making a unilateral decision for all of your employees that won't really match or fit up. We're suggesting that people practice feedback loops with employees, so you can share some previous, here's what we're thinking, here's how we're going to do it, how's this feel, just so that you can get some information. The other is to really think about this, about approaching it with some amount of humanity. I know we're all eager to get back to work. Some of us are living in areas where they have emerged into phase 1 already. And so some of your businesses might actually be open a little bit. Some of you have pivoted your business. And if you're a restaurant, you're doing online ordering. As a firm, we have 6 employees. And so we're continuing much of our work and have been adapting to doing it virtually. But I think it's important that we sort of approach reopening with a little bit of humanity. And so one way to do that is to do a pre-opening assessment of your employees. How are they feeling? How anxious are they? How nervous are they? How worried are they? What do they think customer behavior is going to be like? What that will give you is a good sense of exactly where people's emotional state is, so that you can adapt some of your protocols. So we talk a lot about safe, safer, and safest. So you might have some employees that fit in the safe bucket. They wear masks when they're in public. They have limited their interactions with the universe. Then you might have some employees that are in the safest, which are not leaving their homes at all, not interacting with anyone. And so you want to be cognizant of where your employees are living on that spectrum, so that when you're making decisions on what do your safety guidelines look like when they come back in, that everyone sort of understands what that looks like and feels like. It also allows you to lift up people's emotions and barriers, so that you can make some adaptations and plans to work through that. So a quick little slide about law and advice, and some reminders. The first is that you want to remember that people's health status is confidential. So that means if someone has COVID, or acquires COVID once you do reopen, you aren't allowed to tell other employees that. You are able to tell them that someone has COVID, but not the individual employee. It's up to them to share that personal information. The same thing goes if somebody lives in a household with someone with immune compromised situation. Again, that's private information. So this is going to get a little tricky as you're making some of the broader decisions. So we are suggesting that people reach out to their insurance providers and legal experts, just to confirm that the decisions you're making both will be covered through your liability policy, but also legal. And so, all of what I'm saying should be wrapped up and buttoned up by insurance and legal. In the before state right now, this is a really good time to be building deeper connections with your employees. And so let's say you furloughed or laid off the majority of your workforce, but you're hoping to reopen and bring them back in. It'd be a time to begin to make connections with them again, see how they're comfortable with returning to work, what that looks like. At the Spark Mill, we are doing coffee time once a week, where we all just turn on Zoom and we have coffee together. And we're using this time not necessarily to talk about work, but just to sort of hang out and nurture that relationship that we would have had in our open workspace. It's also a time for you to create personal connections or to foster personal connections. So I've been encouraging my team to check in with each other once a week. These aren't long meetings. These aren't work meetings. These are, how are you doing? What'd you plant in your garden? What kind of amazing thing did you make for dinner? All of these little conversations that we would have already been having in the office, that we can practice having virtually. Okay, so the Spark Mill is a strategic planning and change management firm. So as you can imagine, lots of people are asking about strategy right now. It is so hard to make a strategy when we don't know what the end point looks like. That's typically where you start a strategy project. You say, what is your desired end state? And then we work out a plan to get there. At this point, we don't know what our desired end state is going to look like. We don't know when things will open fully. We don't know when consumer behavior will be back on track. We don't know when health outcomes will level out again. And so what we're suggesting is a more adapted plan for making strategy. So number one, it's time to rewrite the strategic plan, the work plan, the annual plan, whatever plan that you made where you drew a picture of what the year looked like. Obviously, this year is not following what we thought. And so it's time to get in and begin to make some changes. So the first thing is many of you have done one of three things. You have either gone into hibernation, so you've closed your doors and shuttered things. You have laid off staff. Or you've just gotten down to the smallest possible amount of your team. Some of you have pivoted, so you've changed your business model to provide more online services. You're doing curbside pickup. You are answering phones and providing services in a different way. Some nonprofits have created brand new programs. Some companies, they never sold masks before, but now they're selling masks and making it work. And then others of you have made some adjustments. So you've closed your office, but you're still doing some work. Very few people in the small business sector have done anything business as usual. You've got places like Costco, Lowe's that are actually having a great second quarter because everyone is reaching to them because most of the small businesses have their doors closed. So most of you are going to fall in one of those three buckets. And that really determines how you emerge from that bucket, how slowly you emerge. Do you emerge? What that looks like. There's a local restaurant here in the Richmond area, Nota Bene, and they immediately went to curbside pickup a couple of days afterwards. And then they announced that they were pivoting their entire business model. They weren't ever going to reopen the restaurant. They were going to change into a prepared foods kind of venture. And so they launched that new product and are continuing like that. So it's more of like a provisions kind of store now rather than a restaurant. So that's a good example of an organization or a company that just pivoted already. And so for them, they're going to be looking at strategizing how do they make that work in the long term. So I think the guidance here is to think about things in small chunks. So we're not able to forecast to the end of the year to next year. So we need to think about things in smaller chunks and break down the big decisions into smaller bite-sized things that feel manageable. This is a really good time to re-engage with any vendors that you have that are sort of what I call the helper vendors. So if you have a relationship with a CFO or an accountant, SparkMail, we have a fractional CFO that we work with a couple of hours a month. And so he and I have been doing a lot of forecasting and scenario planning to figure out what the budget possibilities could look like. Comparing it to the forecast that we started the year with, comparing it to last year, imagining that half of our business goes away, imagining that only a quarter goes away, so that I know where my key decision points lie as we walk ahead. So I know where I need to be in July for me to end the year in a way that is fine. I know where I need to be in August. So what this allows you to do is to look at things coming and adapt to them. The second is legal advice. So some of you are going to have some liability issues with customers and clients entering your physical spaces or you providing services within their home. So it'll be really important to have a good sense of perhaps some new policies or guidelines to be sharing with clients and customers so that they understand what you are and are not responsible for. And then the last one is HR guidance. So on the last training webinar that I participated in with VCC, we had the Virginia Employment Commission give a lot of really good information. So if you have questions on that, I would pull up one of those old webinars that they did because there were lots of the questions that everyone asks about how we rehire, what if an employee doesn't want to come back on. But there's also other things to think about in terms of benefits, vacation time, if you had a furloughed or laid off employee versus if you've been able to keep everyone on. What do those things look like? What does your new sick leave policy look like? What does your new telework policy look like? All of those pieces. So it's important to work with someone that can give you proper legal guidance on those issues. So the framework that we've been using and suggesting for people to make decisions is that you should have a strategic plan that looks out 4 weeks, 3 months, 6 months. It's really important to break it into those pieces so that we can adapt. So your 4-week plan gets you almost to the end of the second quarter. So what are you going to do in the first week, second week, third week? What does finance and budgeting look like right now? What adjustments do you need to make? Do you need to delay some purchases? What is the health and vitality of your supply chain? So if you rely on supplies from other people, so for reselling, or if you're relying on raw materials from a supply chain so that you can convert them into retail goods, what is the health of your supply chain? Does it still exist? Do you need to begin to rebuild it? So we're thinking sort of really to the end of the first quarter. Then we're looking out for the next quarter. So what does our 3-month track look like? What can we imagine about the future? So much of the state is in phase 1 right now. Some parts of the state have not emerged into phase 1 yet, may emerge in the next couple of weeks. But by the middle of the summer, can we assume that much of the state will be in phase 2? What does phase 2 look like for you? The state is not giving us concrete guidelines on what phase two could look like. So we have to sort of make some leaps in judgment and figure it out. So paint a picture of what you think phase two could look like for your specific business and decide, okay, so if that's what phase two looks like, then here's what my budget would look like. Here's the kind of behavior I can expect from my employees, from my customers, and here's what I think it's going to do. Then you're doing all of these same things, thinking out 6 months. So we're really going end of June, end of September, and then end of year. Your 3 month and your 6 month plans, these are really written in pencil at this point because the world still could shift around us quite dramatically, as we've seen over the last couple of months. And so making long-term plans at this point, I think, is still tricky. So really, concrete plans live in that 4 week zone, and past there, you're just getting slightly less detailed as you go out. All right, so how do we get on track with our employees? The employees that have special and unique circumstances. And there are lots of special and unique circumstances out there, but these are the three that I think are going to be the most challenging for an employer to deal with. The first is an employee that has primary or secondary responsibility to provide childcare to their children. So because schools are closed, because daycares are opening and slight, you're going to have many employees that have young children or children young enough that they can't be left at home, that they're either being provided primary responsibility for, or they're sharing those duties with a spouse or a partner. So it's really important to sort of think through that on an individual employee basis. The second is the immune compromised households, whether your employee has an issue with their immune system or someone that lives in their home. And the third is transportation. If you have employees that rely on public transportation, it's not working to its full strength right now. It's dealing, I know in the Richmond area, we've been dealing with some significant issues with bus drivers calling out sick, and that's just reducing the frequency. And so things aren't running on time. So those are three really important things for you to bear in mind when you're thinking about what does it look like to rely on employees to come back, and what barriers would they have to come back with full productivity. The second I think is really important, which is can we open equals should we open? And so continuing to think about what are the remote possibilities that we could be exploring. How does that work for us? What is the value of in-persons? We've been talking about this a lot as a team. What are the critical things where we really feel like if we could do it in person, we could do it so much better, versus the things that we've already adapted to doing virtually? And can we just continue to do that a little bit longer? This is really a case to continue to build the virtual skills and toolkits of your employees, if that's possible. Some companies, it's a retail establishment. It's just not as likely that you're able to do many virtual services. So this is where it's really going to depend on your company or your organization. Next is to think about this as an opportunity for transformations. So in a minute, we're going to talk about what does it mean to get back to normal. But I think it's an opportunity for you to grant spatial choices. It's also a moment for you to grant some space for slightly more forgiving atmosphere when it comes to things. So what does it look like to give people working from home? Where is it absolutely essential? You know, we've lived in a world where we thought we had to have team meetings in person. Yeah, what does that look like? You provide services in a certain way. Do you still need to do it that way? Have you figured out a way around it that can adapt? I think the next thing is to really think of and be of months have caused. I talk about this
This
with my kids
meeting
a
is
lot.
being recorded.
They are 7 and 11. And I think as a parent, it's been one of the more challenging parts because typically your kids look to you for the answers to what's happening. And even if you don't exactly know the answer, you can mostly make it up and then research it later and tweak it with them a little bit. But in this case, I didn't know what was happening with the pandemic. I've never been through a pandemic in my lifetime. Affected, the way that I interact with the world and at work. And so I didn't know. I couldn't answer the question for them, what comes next? And I think employees are going to be the same way. They're going to say, what happens if this happens? What happens if this happens? And it's okay that you don't have the answers because we're all figuring this out at the same time. The next piece is to provide some training for your supervisors. So if you work in a company that's big enough that you have people have supervision responsibilities, you're going to want to make sure that your supervisors are speaking with one voice and that the way that they are managing employees' trauma and anxiety and practicing flexibility is cohesive across the whole company. So what you don't want to have is the one supervisor that, is naturally more empathetic and allows their department to act a little different than another. So you want to set some minimum guidelines for your supervisors so that they all know how they should be acting. Having that cohesive value set among your employees is really important to them trusting what's happening. The last piece here is to reimagine rituals. And so rituals are, how do you celebrate birthdays in your offices? What do you do when someone has a great day and they really knock out a project or they make a big sale? How do you, do you have fresh donuts in the break room on Mondays? All of these things that have really relied on closer physical contact. How can you reimagine them? And if you spend the time now to carve those out, it'll be better for the long term. So the next thing is, how do we get on track with customers? And, I think this is a little bit of an unknown space because we don't have a lot of examples yet of what this is going to look like. But I think here we're thinking about what is normal anyway. And I have some harsh advice here, which is I don't think that back to normal is going to be possible. I think this is going to fundamentally change the way that consumers purchase goods, interact with the world, interact with small businesses. It's going to change the way and our comfort level in the way that we engage. And so I think when people are imagining this future of when we're going to go back to normal and everything is going to open, I do think we'll get to the stage where everything is open, but I don't think it's going to look the same way as it did before. We know that some businesses are choosing to require to have customers wear masks, and the ability to read body language and to check in and see how someone's doing while they're wearing a mask is really complicated and difficult. And so that's just a little slight adjustment that we'll be making probably in the short term. But that true back to normal is not going to be possible, at least not in 2020. So imagining what was normal about normal and what parts are going to be residue of all of this and what parts are going to change. So I think the one thing to do is to watch for trends. So Italy has already started reopening, and while that's a different country and they have different value set and behaviors, I think we can begin to watch and see what they're doing. We also have other cities across the country that have already started reopening. So I think if you're curious about how to do something, one thing you can do is look for trends within your specific marketplace. I think your other decision point here is being first to market or having a cautious open. So, there's a whole cohort of salons that opened up on Friday, last Friday when they were allowed to with phase 1. And then you have a different set of salons that have signed on to this national petition that have said, we're not actually going to open yet. We're going to wait and see what happens. We're going to think about maybe reopening in June. And so is your business a first to market business? Are you going to reopen as soon as you are literally allowed to reopen and get back to work? Or are you going to take a more cautious approach? And why or why not? So some of us might be financially obligated to open as quick as possible. Others might still have a little bit more flexibility with taking a more cautious stance. But look for trends. I think it's always great to have a cohort of similar, even competitors that you're talking to and checking in with. The very first week in March, when all of this was beginning to trickle in a little bit, I called up a couple of other consulting firms and design firms and just said, "Hey, what are your policies? What are you doing? What are you thinking?" And we just started sharing back and forth with each other. That's something that you're going to get from a small business community that you're not going to get, from Costco or a Walmart or something like that. So really engaging with your closest competitors, people that you trust and admire in similar spheres that have similar issues, and check in with them and see what they're doing. Even if you don't copy it completely, you might be inspired by part of it, or you might hear part of it. And as a gut check, say to yourself, that is absolutely not what we want to do. And so that's just an opportunity for you to gather feedback on how other people are approaching similar situations that you may be facing. So I think the last piece is really around consumer behavior and messaging. So what is your business or nonprofit's role in a new future? We know that consumer behavior is going to change. We don't know exactly what that looks like. So there is some emergence of sort of that small business love. Because when we were all staying within our homes, your community shrank, your community got smaller. So you ordered takeout maybe from the business right down the street because you wanted to make sure that they were going to be there when you got back. You ordered plants from the nursery right around the corner because you just really fundamentally wanted to ensure that they were there. Maybe your local church did a food drive. And so you participated in that. So our community actually shrank back down. At the same time that we had sort of a national community option with the internet, things that we didn't have, 40 years ago. But we know consumer behavior is going to change. So this is an ability for you to pivot and change your messaging and really focus about communicating your value, your specific role in this new future that everyone is going to be navigating together. I will tell you to be a little careful with the sappy messaging. So what I'm talking about here are all of these new ads that we've seen, which are, we're in it together. And then at the end, it's like, Facebook said it. Or, we can do this. And it's a progressive insurance commercial. So just be mindful of how those things make you feel and then decide what is your key message and what is the emotion that you want consumers and customers to have when they're engaging with your messaging. So nonprofits, our advice has typically been around focusing on how can you tell people how essential you are to a new future and pull on their heartstrings. But I think companies can be doing the same thing. So how can we be talking to future customers? So I think the retail customer versus the business to business customer is going to be a little different. So if you're providing raw materials to a business that is converting them, what you're really checking in on is what do your customers need? What do their plans look like? And how can you be of value to them? Can you provide different things to them? I think it's a moment to be really open with your business model and think about what is your pivot or adjustment strategy that will fill the need that is created in this new future that we don't exactly know what it looks like, but we can begin to make some of those adjustments. So those are my big, broad thoughts. I'm going to stop screen sharing, and I really wanted to have you guys lift up some of the questions or specific things that you were wondering about. I'd be happy to chat about, or if any of the slides generated a specific question for you.
Yes, please, if you have questions for Sarah, please put those in the Q&A or the chat. But since we don't have anything now, can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. I continually hear from employers that they are, they're calling employees to come back, and they, for whatever reason, feel that they're not comfortable coming back to work. Now, unfortunately, some of those is because they're making more money on getting unemployment than to come back. So how would you, as an employer, handle that situation?
Yeah, so I think it goes back to that first thing, which is what is a person's barrier? right, the way that they structured the unemployment, the COVID bump, the extra $600 a week, it put people's hourly wage in the $21, $22 an hour, which is more than a lot of people were making. So it's tricky. How can you tell an employee, it'd be great if you could come back, but I can't afford to pay you that same amount. So I think, but there's a lot of people that are unemployed. And so there's a lot of people that you could build a new workforce with. VEC, I think, had some good information on if an employee turns down a job, whether or not they'll be eligible in the long term. But that $600 bump, it's only authorized, I think, through the end of June or the end of July. So that is likely to disappear at some point. But I think it's important to think through what is that employee's life situation, what gaps and barriers. So if an employee doesn't want to come back to work because they're making more money on unemployment, then they're not going to survive a appeal process with the Virginia Employment Commission. If that employee doesn't want to come back to work because they have a child at home that there's no other option for childcare right now, then there's a likelihood that they would survive an appeal process. And I think that's why checking in with your employees, especially if you have a smaller workforce, and just understanding what that looks like. So everyone on the Spark Mill team has kids. And I think the youngest is 18 months and then the oldest is 12. And so each of us have a slightly different circumstance on what it means. And so while it's good to have blanket HR policies, this is also a moment where it's going to be really important to understand what are the individual limitations at play and how you can navigate them. But there's no easy answer except that they have to come back to work if they don't have a legitimate reason, and it won't survive appeal.
Okay, we have a question from Julia Seward. It's regarding employees coming back. Epidemiologists are suggesting that older vulnerable employees should still stay at home as much as possible and work from home if possible during first phases. When talking with older vulnerable employees, should you remind them of that when discussing coming back to work choices? It seems that should be a part of script across organizations as a statement of fact and decision factor.
Yeah, Julia. So I think here what we're thinking about is, what is your policy? So you can't make a policy that says people over 55 can't come back to work. That's going to land in the age discrimination. So this is a moment for your supervisors to be having one-on-one conversations with your employees to say, there is a increased likelihood. It increases significantly in the 60 to 70. So before then, it looks kind of like this. The 50 to 60-year-olds, they have some increased chance. I think it goes from 1% to 2%. But then the 60 to 70, I think it jumps to 8%. And so at some point, it becomes an individual employee's responsibility to understand the limitations and what it looks like. So you can either have a policy and a script that says, this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to handle it. These are the special circumstances that we want you as an employee to think through. We want you to think through childcare. We want you to think through, whether you are more likely to have a severe infection if you acquire COVID. You're also going to need to think through what is going to happen if COVID happens in your workspace. So in the last webinar, we talked about having some safety guidelines that imagined a future that you totally reopened, and then someone in the workspace gets it. So this happened locally this week. A salon was open, and customer came in, they got their hair cut. The next day they called and said that they had actually just received a positive test. And so they had safety guidelines that said that stylist that worked with that customer was immediately self-isolating for 14 days, and that the salon closed for 1 day and did a deep cleaning. So I think it's important and part of the decision-making factor for employees if you tell them this is what will happen if COVID comes into our workspace. And it really is going to depend on what your workspace looks like. The larger a workspace, the less likely that a COVID case in that workspace will transmit to everyone, because it has to do when you're getting it from air and not from just touching things. What they're suggesting right now is that it has to do with the duration of the airflow in the room and how long you're in that space. So this is why they're saying right now, the best information we have is that a grocery store is slightly safer than a really small office, because in a grocery store, you as a grocery shopper are entering, walking around, and leaving, versus the grocery store employee who is living in that workspace all day long and breathing the same air. So that's just an example of things in terms of sort of airflow and physical space. And again, I think this is why having that work group set up from lots of employees so that you can think through what it looks like.
Okay. And by the way, Julia said thanks that she thinks that it's mostly making them aware of that information that they can use for their own decision making. Put the responsibility, I guess, on them. I've got another question.
Yeah.
How best as an employer can I share with my customers of what we're doing as a business and what our employees are doing to protect them?
Yeah.
You know, getting ready to open the doors. This is what we're doing. How, I guess, what can we say and what we cannot say?
Well, you can tell them what your guidelines and policies are, how you're approaching cleaning, how you're approaching social distancing. You can tell them your mask wearing policies. There's a local appliance repair company in the Richmond area, and they post a picture of their temperatures every single morning on Facebook. And I thought that that was at first I was like, I can't believe they're putting that up there. But it was a way to create a level of comfort with their customers, because those customers aren't coming to them, they're going to their customers. And so now, every day it says, okay, health status, and it's a picture of their sanitation supplies and a temperature check for each of the employees. So I think, each company is going to have a slightly different way to approach that, but I thought that was a really creative solution. I think the key that everyone needs right now, and the piece that we're all craving, is just transparency. So how are you cleaning? Do you have supplies available for me to use as a customer if I'm entering your space? Are you requiring that I provide my own supplies, like my own mask, when I'm coming in? What are your policies with your employees? So are you requiring any employee with a fever to not work that day? Are you requiring testing? What does that look like? So any amount of information that you can provide a customer, I think will answer the people on that spectrum, that safe, safer, safest. So the safe and the safer customer is going to read that and just make an independent decision. Same thing with the employee versus the safest. They may look at it and think, this is not enough for me. I'm not going to re-engage right now.
Okay. Julia has one other question. So you know of any organizations that are already engaging a large volunteer corporation, and how are they doing it?
I don't know of anybody Feed More is using a lot. So that's our local food bank in the Richmond area. Most of the food banks around the state have not stopped, and they're still using volunteers. We also have a farm, Shalom Farms. I know that they're using volunteers still. So in both cases, I think that they have just spread out and created larger work areas. Oh, here's another good example. Studio 23, which is an artist studio here in the Richmond area. They got a grant to make masks for first responders. So they have a big event space, and they taped off the floor and created these little buckets of workspaces, require everyone to wear masks. So I think it really depends on what is your volunteer doing for you, and how can you apply social distancing guidelines and safety guidelines on that activity. I know some of the habitats around the state a couple have started up again with just a much smaller workforce. And I know that some of them are planning a larger reopening back into that in June. So again, I think it's really just going to depend on what do your volunteers do for you, and how does that engage? Can they do independent work, or are you using them to engage with clients or program participants? Most of the programming type volunteer opportunities, I have not seen any of those specifically restart. It's mostly those where they're using volunteer time and talent to replace what otherwise would be paid work, like a Feed More working in a kitchen, Meals on Wheels deliveries, and Habitat homes.
Okay. And I just wanted to, I don't see any other questions, but I wanted to note that you referenced the May 8th session that you did with Virginia Employment Commission. That is available. I put the links that you can find that session on Virginia Community Capital's website and on our Facebook page, that you can watch that and hear those comments. Sarah, as always, you do an outstanding job. Thanks so much for the time to put this together. Sarah will be back with us Tuesday at 6 p.m. to repeat this session. And I mentioned this to our audience, that if you know someone that could take advantage and benefit from Sarah's knowledge, please invite them to join us. That is next Tuesday at 6 p.m. And also, I wanted to put a plug in for our webinar that we're going to be hosting next Friday. This is focused on the Paycheck Protection Program Loan Forgiveness Explained. And we're going to be doing a webinar with Virginia Community Capital, but also the Virginia Small Business Administration and the Virginia Small Business Development Center Network, because now that people are getting the PPPs, it's now, how do I best prepare that I can turn that loan into a forgivable loan? And how do I prepare? So hopefully you can join us next Friday at noon. And again, you can find information on that on our website or on our Facebook page. But thanks again for everybody for joining us. And again, Sarah, thanks so much for your time. I know it's time consuming to put these presentations together, and I appreciate you supporting this program for us and helping other employers in Virginia be prepared. Wanted to see, and just getting some thanks for the presentation and for what you did on both chat and on the Q&A. So great job. Hope everybody has a wonderful holiday weekend. Take Monday off if you can. And I know here in beautiful Southwest Virginia, it's quite dank, but try to enjoy some time. If anything, just try to relax and get ready for the following week. So thanks again, everybody, and I hope you have a great weekend. Bye.